As the finale for this evening, we have a really special guest, Omar Khan, who is joining us shortly from San Francisco. Omar is truly a citizen of the world. He was educated in Vienna and Islamabad and graduated from Dartmouth College in Columbia and Stanford University. But today, Omar is an award-winning web designer, writer, and historian. But his passions in life were shaped most of all by his childhood in Pakistan. There was his grandmother's house in Lahore, and can you believe this? Crossings of the Khyber Pass to get into Afghanistan to join in his, I think it's sports lessons. I would have thought, getting across the Khyber Pass itself was exercise enough. How the world has changed since then, I don't suppose that even Omar would think about going across the Khyber Pass just for a sports lesson. But childhoods are the most impressionable parts of our lives. And I think Omar, his history bears this out, because he was interested from an early age in early photography, and collected old postcards until today, more than 30 years later. He's got in excess of 15,000. I mean, that was the last time I read about it on the internet. Omar, you've probably got far more than that by now. So it's not just Phibis that have been graced by Omar's presence. The BBC were there before us and interviewed him for an Outlook programme a few years ago now. I think it was 2019. But tonight, Omar's going to tell us a little bit about his book, which is a collection of old postcards. It's called Paper Jewels. We love the title, Omar, and I've got a special request. Maybe you might think about giving us permission to use one of your postcards, any one of them, for the next edition of our journal, and we can put it as the design for our front cover.
Of course.
We'd love it if we could have your permission. Thank you. So, without further ado, then, I'll hand you over to Omar Khan. Thank you, Omar.
Hello, everyone from San Francisco. It's an honor to be here and speak to you. And I wish I could be there at Oxford myself. But in the event, much of what I'm going to share with you this evening was done as research when I was in Oxford in the summer of 2019. And I discovered a whole bunch of sources on the early history of British postcards that I didn't even know about when my book came out. So I'm happy to share with you my research from my visit then. And I'm going to cut to my slideshow, and show you and share with you some of the postcards that I wanted to talk about this evening, and give you a little bit of a trajectory of the publication of Indian postcards in Britain in that golden bucket of years between 1898 and 1908, which is thought of as the golden age of picture postcards. And I think it's worth thinking about for a moment that for people in those Edwardian days, postcards were like television is to us perhaps today. They really were the first time that people all across the world were able to see what other places and other people looked like on a mass scale. You literally had billions of images exchange hands very quickly. All right, hopefully you can see this screen of women baking bread on the left. And I wanted to just start by telling you, how did I ever get into postcards? So I live in San Francisco. I've lived here for more than 30 years now. And about 30 years ago, I went to a paper show about an hour drive from here. And going through these boxes of old postcards, as you have paper shows in Britain as well, to which many I've visited, I picked up this postcard called Women Baking Bread. And it took me right back to my grandmother's home at 5 Queens Road in Lahore, where she would sit with a servant girl. They'd be shelling peas or cutting okra. The charpai would be propped up against the wall. The mudka, where the milk is hanging there from the top, so the cat couldn't get to the milk. And it just was such a Proustian moment for me that I just absolutely loved the postcard, and that actually began my whole journey of collecting. As it turned out, this postcard is a very, very early postcard of India. In fact, it's probably among the first set of postcards ever manufactured in India. This was a postcard made, as I later found out, by a German lithographer who was working in Bombay. But as we just step back for a second, I just wanted to say that the story of postcards is really a story of business, of art, of internationalism, of trade protocols, of postal regulations. Postcards really were the Instagram of their time. But unlike Instagram, they actually left something tangible for us to look at and admire and collect today. So just to give you a sense of where a postcard like the one you just saw was manufactured, this is sort of the man on the top left is Fritz Schleicher, who ran the Ravi Varma press in Bombay in the 1890s through about 1930. This was a press that had been imported in the early 1890s by Ravi Varma, the great painter, and postcards were made using lithographic technologies where you had stone prints, the image on a stone print, colors applied, and then different blocks of stone, which you might see in the corners of one of those images, put through a press by hand. And Paul Gerhardt was a painter and the chief lithographer at the press. And around 1898, 1899, just as the postcard craze was beginning in Europe and mainland Europe, and I'm not talking about Britain here, they had the idea to start making postcards for the Indian market. So another very early postcard that he made was this one of Victoria Station, which at that time was actually labeled Bori Bandar Station. And I think a speaker before me actually showed it in their talk as well. And the quote on the left says, "Magnificent station, but far too big for requirements." Now, today it is the largest single train station in the world. I think 3 million people pass through it each day, which might be more than British Rail serves in a single day. But you can get a sense of, very nice design and painting, in a sense, being made to use this card, multiple colors applied. But it was a very difficult process to make. And it was just the very beginning of what postcards became. Postcards really started in Europe. And here I'm showing you a postcard from 1897, which is where I think it was from, although the stamp there might suggest it's from 1895, which was really the very beginning of postcards in Germany and Austria. This was actually printed in Austria, but it was a Calcutta-based photographer, Werner Rössler, who may have been Austrian, who had it printed in Austria, made from his photographs. And you get a sense of the beautiful design that went into postcards like this. You've got the white space in the front where people wrote, because laws at that time required that you could only put a message on the front of the card, and the entire back of a card had to be for the address. And sometimes people put stamps on the front or the back, and that was a whole artistic sort of thing to it. This is another early Greetings from India card. This is from 1897, and you can just see the way people often signed cards in the front. They'd show their whole signature. They would have fun with it. It was kind of a bit of a performance thing for someone to come out with a postcard at that time. And these are among the very first, and probably the first, artist-signed postcards of India. This is, again, an Austrian, this is Joseph Hoffmann, who was actually quite a well-known painter. And this is an ad for his postcard that appeared in an Austrian journal for postcard collectors and experts called Die Illustrierte Postkarte. And it was actually published in English, French, and German simultaneously. And as I will show you in a moment, it was finding a journal like this at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford that let me piece together the history of the early British postcard. But you can just look at the design and craft that went into a postcard like this. This is a gate in Jaipur. And now I'll show you the place of contrition in Varanasi in Benares. Now, the litmus test for a great postcard in those early days in the late 1890s was how well you could depict a sunset. And this was certainly a masterpiece in its own way. And this came out in, I think it was July 1898. This actually has an English electrotype. By the way, one of my favorite words in postcard sort of studies is the word electrotype, which refers to the text that is printed on a postcard in the front and the back. Because Joseph Haydn, which was a small publisher in Vienna, actually had a relationship with Thacker Spink & Co. in Calcutta and Bombay to actually make an English version of these postcards, which were then sold to the British Indian market. So there was already a very international, global kind of sort of market around postcards. And the great thing was that when you sent a postcard from one place to the other, people there could immediately see it and copy it. So you'd have Japanese postcard exhibitions in Vienna, for example, and that would inspire Viennese artists to make other postcards. These are postcards by publishers, often British, in India. So the top left is a postcard by Johnson and Hoffman the very famous photographers who had offices in Calcutta. This is from 1898, actually. On the right side is one by Higginbotham and Company, which was Madras, Chennai-based photographer, with a message in front of it. In those days, it was actually, you'd want a smaller image in the front because ink was expensive. So that's why often some of these very early postcards have just a very small image in the front. At the bottom left is another Thacker Spick and Company with nice design. This is also Varanasi. And on the very right is by a lithographer, a British lithographer in Bombay, William Cooper. The funny thing is, if you notice the three ones on the left, these postcards are all quart-sized cards. So the British originally had an illustrated postcard standard, which was smaller than the sort of standard continental European cards, like the Higginbotham card on the top. And it was only when regulations were changed around 1902, 1903 that Britain got with the continental system, because for economic reasons, we didn't want to have two different print sizes because it made the printing press experience much more difficult. Most of the cards in the early postcards in the late 1890s and even the early 1900s were printed in Germany. For example, most of the cards in America, for example, were printed by German publishers, and most of the first British cards were actually printed in Germany. But let's turn now for a moment. Actually, one more I wanted to show you. An early British publisher, although he was born in India. This is Harry Clifton Soundy, who I think I actually learned about him in a way from the Phoebus database, thanks to Beverly Hallam, who told me about the entry for him being there. I learned a little bit more about him. But these are some of his very early cards from the late 1890s, maybe early 1900s. These are, again, quart-sized cards. And the ones on the right, the top one of Bombay, the bottom one of Jaipur, these are actually hand-colored. So you have the black and white postcard that he had printed in Germany, which was a collotype, and then you had a hand stencil come over it and somebody apply watercolor to make it colored. So it was a very manual process in those days. And these are two very beautiful cards by him, and you can get a sense, the German name for these were printed in Germany, was Lichtdruck, or light print. And you literally had the press, this was a collotype, go through and apply the colors in multiple ways. And you can see from the woman on the right, the Mohammedan woman, that how carefully you could even see translated from a photograph, and that glass kind of plate was then used within the press to make up to 2,000 or 3,000 copies, but then it had to be discarded and redone. Then you had the halftone come up, which is the same process that we use today in magazines, where you had an inkjet type printer print through a screen of holes, the ink, and then the eye would join everything together. But when you look very closely, there's less ink applied, and it became actually the least expensive method. And this is the method that then dominated and was used in Britain in a big way to sort of further its industry. And at the very bottom, you have the real photo postcard, which you may be used to as you're still familiar with today. We actually had a photograph printed on a postcard. But now let's turn to the situation in Britain and what happened within Britain when postcards were printed. So I was very lucky, 2 summers ago, to discover this magazine of the picture postcard at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And this gives you a really good trajectory of how the first Indian postcards came out in Britain. And actually, the first mention was there was one missionary postcard printed just before this date, but the first mention of postcards of India that were available in Britain was in September 1901. And they were, the same postcard actually of these Bhil women, tribal women, was reused in 1902. And this was, the way postcards worked is that you actually have a photograph and a photographer then reprint the photograph from multiple publishers. And this was just at the beginning of when postcards started becoming popular in Britain. The Europeans were a little bit ahead, and I'll just give you a quote from the magazine. Quote, "Hitherto India has been but sparsely represented in our," "in our collections. Now, however, she appears to be awakening to the infinite use of the picture postcard, and thanks to a kind correspondent in Allahabad, we are in receipt of the most interesting cards from northern Hindustan. As will be seen from our illustration, the pictures of native Indian life and architecture are extremely interesting. The most casual reader must see how potent may become these tiny missives in spreading a knowledge of and creating sympathy with our fellow subjects in distant Hindustan." So this is the way these first postcards were received. And this was actually Cambridge and Company, which was a bookseller in India, a British bookseller in India, was the company that actually printed these postcards. You can see exactly under that postcard the Cambridge and Company version, from Bombay. And on the right is another postcard from Darjeeling, which was made from that initial series around 1901. Now, you may not see that in what you're seeing, but at the very bottom right, there's a little note there that says that Raphael Tuck and Company have been appointed as the the official photographers to Their Majesties, the King and Queen. So I just want to make that note, and I'm going to come back to it in a moment. So to show you another postcard from this series, this one of Malabar Point in Bombay, which has a long message. I want to just point out one thing, and this is the way many of these postcards are written. They're like, people had so much message to write, they completely cover the card, if not sometimes the image as well. But I'm going to make a note here from what the message says, where the writer, Edmund, writes, as you would take, he's writing to a woman, and he writes, also, you will take me for a stranger. However, I cannot let pass the opportunity of sending you just before my departure for Europe, and to show you that I'm still thinking of you. Now, one thing that is very interesting about postcards that I discovered in my research, and I talk about this in my book as well, is that most postcards were sent to women, and women were the biggest collectors of postcards, both in Europe as well as in Britain. In fact, one of the ways that Tux made postcard collecting really popular within Britain was to have these huge competitions in 1901, 1902, 1903, with like £1,000, £2,000, £3,000 prize money, which was given to the biggest collection of Tuck postcards. And I think in 1902, 2 out of the top 4 winners were women. 6 of the 8 second-tier art prizes went to women. And I think 25 of the top 29 next-tier prizes were also to women. And the winner she had collected like 25,000 Tux postcards. And that's how she got, I think, the £100 prize. And then it was distributed more, below. And these were, of course, maybe there was some romantic interest in these postcards, but it was fathers writing to daughters. It was British officers and civilians serving in India writing to their families back home. But it was also that I think we find today, my friend Leonard Pitt, who's an expert on, postcards of France, really has said that, women controlled the parlor in those days and the albums in middle class and, upper middle class houses. And that's where the postcards went after they were collected and put in. And it seems that women were the most ardent collectors of postcards, because when you buy albums today from dealers, you often find that it's a woman who has put the collection together, or it's her name there. And I think that's kind of an interesting point. In fact, in Vienna, there was a ditty about postcards, and they wrote there that the beauty of a woman depends on how many postcards she owns. So this was something that I think women really were involved with in a big way, and one of those sort of first mass media forms where I think women played a sort of important role. I want to show you this example from 1901 of a very beautiful postcard, where if you can keep the imperialist message to the side for a second. This is Lord Clive of India. It has a very nicely composed, left there's sort of a collar type image of him, beneath all this British regalia, all the battles that he won, at the very top, just named his sort of, dates of his life, and then very clearly put exactly, a space where you could actually write. And by the end of that year, so 1901, the picture postcard, the magazine was writing, the British postcard movement is not only full of latent possibilities, it is even now vibrating with the manifestations of life so vigorous that it is barely possible for one man to keep cognizant of all its developments and ramifications. So in this case, you had E.W. Richardson, who was the editor and wrote most of the pieces, wrote this. I will say that nationalism was also a big force in getting postcards moving, because the British really wanted to compete with the Germans and the French, and even the Austrians, who had so many postcards. So they really felt that it was part of their national interest to become good postcard printers. And you would have a number of photographers in India who would say that our postcards are printed in Britain, not in Germany, even though it was slightly more expensive perhaps to do them. So you had a bit of nationalistic interests as well going on in these times. So then let's turn to Hartman's and Company. So in December 1902, Hartman and Company announced in this ad, this is actually February, first it was December 19, but this is from February 1903. Frederick Hartman was actually an indigo merchant at 22 Great Tower Street in London, who told the picture postcard who went to interview him that since the indigo trade only happened from November through February, he had nothing to do the rest of the year. He had seen that postcards had become a big fad in Europe, so why not print them? And he was determined to bring it to Britain. As it turned out, he was one of the people who was important to getting the standard changed, where you actually could have a photograph cover the whole front of an image, and you could write a message and the address in the back. And he had the UK laws, changed to that effect, it is said, by 1902. And it's just important to just point out for a second that much like the internet and other systems, protocols made a big difference here, because you had to have legal and postal regulation support the fact that you could actually send an image, and this only happened in the 1890s and through the early 1900s. So I wanted to show you this postcard. His postcards of India were so exciting to the Picture Postcard Monthly that they wrote them up and they would publish them on the left. I'm using here a slightly later color version of the same postcard that you see up there, because one of the things about Hartman is that he did really good publicity, and he knew how to sort of advertise his postcards and talk big about them to people. So in the sort of byline about this, I'll just give you a sense of how they described this postcard, because this was right after came out just as the Delhi Darbar was happening. It had just happened in December 1902, January 1903. Quote, "Here it will be remembered, a grand ball took place at which 3,500 guests danced and promenaded in the halls of Divan-e-Am and Divan-e-Khas. This beautiful hall, lit up by the electric light of 1,000 lamps, was a dream of beauty which outshone the most gorgeous illusions of the stage. And on this occasion, at least, the hall justified the proud motto which decorates its walls and which proclaims that if there is a paradise on earth, it is the Divan-e-Khas. Delhi does not, however, exhaust the Hartman series of interesting view cards," and on, and they talked up, how nice these cards were. And you can get a sense of, the color type, which is what these cards were. Here we have the illustration in the magazine where they talk about this, and here you see the coolie, the Darjeeling area shown, and the richness of the image. Even in the studio image, they brought in the man, they brought in his basket, he's sitting on a crate. But you can see there's a lot of detail there, and I think the sense of being able to see what other people really looked like and images was really part of what made this appeal. And they were writing at this point that, so by the way, just so you know, a card cost about 1 penny, which was a very firm belief on Hartman's part in particular, that postcards should be cheap and available to the masses. And it is true that this was a form, an image form, that people could reach and use at all, at all levels of society. And Hartman, in fact, I think he had told Richardson in one of his talks that if we want to reach the masses, to make postcard collecting and using as popular as on the continent, we must keep the popular price of 1 penny. This was in 1902. And here you get another sense. This is in Shimla, Annandale, just looking down the richness of how well a color type could actually represent reality. "The main object of the illustrated postcard," said Hartman, "is to bring before the eyes of a distant friend a particular scene or object of interest or beauty surveyed or enjoyed by the sender when posting the card. What is more natural than the wish, when enjoying the beautiful object, to share it with some friend, relation, or dear one, not able to enjoy its contemplation with the sending?" So the greetings from message is implicit, not in only the very first cards, but then in cards like this, and of course even in the Instagram or Facebook posts that we make too. We're always sort of sending a message to someone and greeting them. The other thing about postcards that some people lamented is that they actually made it much easier to send a message to somebody because you didn't have to write a long letter. So I think one of the quotes about postcards in these early days was, "Everyone knows what a bore it is to have to write letters home when traveling. The picture postcard comes as a boon and a blessing," because obviously you just could write a short message, here in the corner. The other thing to notice about the postcard industry is that it really was based on fashion and the quick development and sort of the need in the market to have change. So we very quickly moved from black and white to color. In fact, just to give you a sense of the statistics, in Germany in 1903, 1.1 billion postcards were produced, and that is a lot of postcards for every German alive then. In the US, it was about 770 million. Britain, about 600 million. But if you add India to it, that's another 250 million, and they were very happy to have more postcards than Britain if you added, India together. And little Austria alone had 400 million. Not all of these were illustrated, but the bulk of them were at this point illustrated. So you get a sense of how this really was a mass phenomena and how fashion and human interest drove rapid change, because every publisher wanted to be better and less expensive than the other publisher. And that also drove this sort of change from lithograph to color type to halftone, because halftone was ultimately the least expensive. So on the left is a color type of this woman. On the right actually is a colored, but it's a halftone, so that some money could be saved because of it was cheaper to produce something that way. So these are some postcards that Hartman made together with Johnston and Hoffman, and they're described by the picture postcard. I'll let its words speak. Mr. Hartman has brought out 2 sets of cards illustrating the inhabitants of India at the present day. The extraordinary mixture of the old and the new, which has resulted from the English occupation, meets us on almost every card. The Toby or washerman exercises his functions on an English white shirt by standing beside a river and beating it against a grooved board, apparently a very destructive method. The prosperous native constable looks handsome in his white clothes and red turban, while the postman is more conservative in matter of dress and is picturesque in snuff-colored garments. And then you have this, woman also from Darjeeling in a sort of color type that I'll show you. Now, some more of his, picture types. By the way, the Babu, the cyclist on the right, bicycles were the hot modern commodity at that time. So men and women on bicycles were actually very popular postcard subjects. And on the left you have the water carrier, who obviously was somebody who was extremely important to people. By the way, where you put a stamp on the front, not only for decoration as a way of sort of embellishing the postcard, and I love collecting postcards which have nicely colored stamps. Actually, there's also a message in the stamp, and the way the stamp was turned, and I'll show you that in a second. But there are many nice examples of the way stamps were used to sort of let the person who's sending the postcard add their own little touch to a postcard. So these are very early postcards of Kashmir. This is by Hartman as well, which I think they had printed. These are halftones, but they had printed using Tux, perhaps printing press, but these are Hartman labeled. And you can see the top card on the right. The man has signed it himself. He's put the stamp on the front to match the colors. And you had this sense of, Kashmir cards especially. And, I think for those of you who know, British Indian photography, very few residents of British India actually made it to Kashmir, but about 30% of all the photographs in albums actually tend to be of Kashmir because of its so great beauty and the great photographers who worked there and the great interest in this kind of an alpine landscape. Similarly, there were a lot of postcards of Kashmir, which are kind of interesting, and they often have these little titles at the bottom right that may sort of distinguish them from other postcards of India. And you get into some really beautiful colored cards at this period around 1904 to 1906 by Hartman. This is a view in the zoological gardens in Calcutta. Now, I should say that for my book and on my website, where I post a new postcard every day or two, we restore these postcards digitally. So this postcard, though, has hardly been restored. This is one of those cards that you manage to get sometimes from a dealer or from a person in the album, where it's actually been kept in a way, because these are all 100 years or 100 years or more than 100 years old, and they often get damaged, or the colors fade or the colors change. So restoring them to their original beauty is something that I very much like to do. This is a shot in Calcutta. This is the pontoon bridge. You can see on the left, where the bridge was actually propped up by these boats. And you can see the way the stencil print was made on the left, that it doesn't quite meet the boat all the time. the writer in the Picture Postcard Monthly writes, Mr. Hartman has issued a great number of cards illustrating the scenery, antiquities, and people of our Indian Empire. We see all the strange contrasts of the East in the 7 sets of view cards of India. Civilized Calcutta, with its electric trams and busy streets, stands alongside a native village girl that might have belonged to the Stone Age. This was from 1904. And here is actually Indian, Darjeeling, Coolie Girl, which is almost like a Hollywood type. And this is a completely unrestored card. So you can see what the original colors in these cards looked like. And the next 2 shots are of Delhi, and sort of to give you a sense of the cards. Now, you'll see the stamps at the top on the card on the right, a street scene of Delhi. So in the language of stamps in those days, the stamp on the left, which is tilted one way, says, "Do not write to me anymore." The stamp on the right says, "When will I see you?" So actually 2 conflicting messages sent in the same card. And you actually had cards come out in those days, which showed you how each position of a stamp could mean, "I love you," "Don't write me again," "I miss you," "I don't miss you," whatever. So there was a whole other language that people developed, much as they do today on Instagram or Facebook, a little secret coding language that sort of went on between people, as well as, the decoration, the decorative aspect. Because in fact, in this case, someone has put although this card was mailed from England to someone else, I think from India to someone else in England, they actually put a little French stamp at the bottom, which would not have obviously helped, for the postage. Now, as it turned out, Hartman was a gambler and a businessman in many ways, and went bankrupt in 1907. The firm paid dividends till 1909, but they sold off all their stock and actually couldn't quite make it. And this is the story of many, many postcard publishers all over Europe at that time, where they were bankrupted very quickly by cheaper publishers who came out, the fact that the fad had changed, there were better images available elsewhere. But I also think that, in part, Hartman was bankrupted by the rise of Raphael Tuck and Company. So Raphael Tuck and Sons is probably, I think some people would say, arguably the most important postcard publisher in the history of the medium. So as I said before, even though the medium really began in Europe, and that's where perhaps a lot of the development happened in the early years, ultimately it was Tuck that became the biggest global publisher and printer of postcards. And they really dominated, thanks also to the British Empire controlling so much of the globe, the postcard trade all over the world. And they were just an example of British global presence, and they were also a great marketing firm. So even better than Hartman, they were able to market their wares. So to show some very early Tuck's cards of India, on the right is the Taj, and this is this could be 1899, 1900, maybe 1901. It's a quart-sized card, that old British standard. On the left is a larger card. This is 1901, where an Indian card, this is a catamaran outside Madras, was actually published as a part of a series on boats. They also had this set of cards, a set of 6 cards, which were made around the Darbar, showing different events. Now, in those days, a set of 6 cards was the main kind of set of cards that people published, because from the early days on, publishers like to sell sets, but also bows of 24 cards were put into printing presses, and it was very easy to cut those into groups of 6. So Tux became a really big name also through the picture postcard publishers, through their competitions that they held all the time, and really rose to another level when they came out with their Wide World series and what is called an oilette. And as they described their oilettes in their marketing language, an oilette postcard is a miniature facsimile oil painting produced directly from the original. It is therefore always a work of art. So the Wide World series, which they described as already famed as the most artistic postcards of the most picturesque spots in the world. This is the February 1905 ads. So the first oilettes came out in 1903, the Wide World series in 1905, and India was among the very first oilette and Wide World series cards to be published. Ultimately, they published around 70 sets of 6 cards. That's about 3,000 of their total, output of about 3,000 sets. And oilettes dominated postcard publishing of India throughout the world, well into the 1930s. By the way, you can see these same cards sometimes made from photographs from the 1890s or even earlier, but they were printed as oilettes, almost until partition. So here we see some cards. I've put in the color cards over the black and white cards in the magazine. This was made, the royal visit in 1905. And so I'm just quoting again from the magazine. One of the most important functions of the picture postcard is to provide us with souvenirs of current events. This fact has long been recognized by Raphael Tuck and Sons, who had made it part of their regular policy. And they produced a souvenir card of the visit of His Royal Highness the Prince and Princess of Wales to India, a visit which we hope will inaugurate a new set of plenty and prosperity for our Eastern Empire. Ironically, Queen Mary was one of the people, by the way, later Queen Mary, who really popularized collecting of postcards, because she was a postcard collector, and I've seen her albums at Windsor Castle, and they're really quite interesting. Clifton and Company, actually, since she was in India, and oilettes had not yet quite made it there in a big way. Most of the postcards of India were actually Clifton and Company cards that she had collected. But you get a sense here of how exciting it was to have these postcards, suddenly appear. And you can imagine again what it must have been like for people, in Britain in those days to see India in color in a way that was so easily accessible and inexpensive. But there was a secret to the oilette, which was that most of the oilettes of India, in fact, nearly all of them, were always based on photographs. And they just colorized and repainted photographs to make them look much nicer. So at the bottom right is actually a photograph by Johnson and Hoffman of exactly the same scene, and then the way it was colorized on top. And on the left is one of the envelopes they used to put in their set of 6 cards. This is one of, quote, first native life in India card sets, and of which the Postcard magazine wrote, the latest addition to Messrs. Tuck and Sons postcards comprise a most interesting set in the Wide World series under the title Native Life India, on which are portrayed devil dancers, snake charmers, lamas, or Buddhist priests, fakirs, and lastly, an Aboriginal Rajputana. So let me just show you those. You can see these here. In fact, the one on the left, the fakirs, the woman in red, I've seen the magic lantern slide original of this, and it's actually a very old woman who is made to look a little bit, younger here. But these are all from photographs, but again, very nicely colored and very nicely done. This is one of the first Bombay images. This is the actually main post office in Bombay. And post offices were often featured in postcards because they actually sent the volume of mail that went to these post offices skyrocketing, in India as well. So there are about 1,000 Tuck's postcards of India, perhaps 500 to 600 oilettes, and the rest were made on order by various merchants over the years. So at the bottom right, the photograph actually that was used to make the oilette on top had been, I think, some Bombay merchant had Tuck's make a color-type photograph based on their photographs that they had gotten from a photographer that was then later turned into an oilette. So here you can see how far back in history Tuck's would even go. In this case, they're actually showing, this is actually a painting by R. Catton Woodville, who was one of the most famous British painters of the time of British battle scenes. And he painted this visit of the first, Britisher to the imperial Mughal in Delhi, I think from 1599. So you sort of get a sense, this is a part of our Empire series. So they really tried to cover all of history with these photographs. This is one of the most popular oilettes of Bombay, where you can see a tram going and the sort of sense of modernism coming in. And many people argued for the postcard in those days as being something educational. In fact, Richardson wrote in the Picture Postcard Monthly, one of the best functions performed by the Picture Postcard is that of educating the laboring classes up to a love for the beautiful, and thus cooperating with all the other agencies for their uplifting. In fact, the educational value was, plugged for not only by, British magazines and promoters, but in Austria as well, in other parts of the world, here in the US as well. So it was really, in fact, Richardson in 1906 would speak of the possible value of cards representing the homes of great poets and inducing the careless to read their works. So, these patronizing lines aside, certainly I think there was a certain education that happened through these postcards, and the fact that a single postcard was probably seen by many, many people in a family through albums and had a long shelf life, and sort of really did help open people's eyes up to other places. This is a particularly beautiful card of Bombay, Abu Rahman Street, and you can see on the right the scaffolding on the building as it is still being constructed. So as I mentioned, you often had this development and fashion changing. So here you have a bit later, I think this is 1907, 1908 card, where they actually had this oil facsimile card, where they tried to represent, this is slightly embossed actually, where they tried to make the card look even more like a painting. This is the bridge in Chennai. And you can sort of see the imprint, I think, in the clouds, more clearly towards the top. And this one from Bangalore, shows, South Parade. This is now, by the way, MK Gandhi Street, and it's incredibly crowded. And, it takes an hour to even go down here, given the traffic in the afternoons. But you get a sense of how you really always wanted to heighten and change things and expectations of the consumer, so they had an even nicer time and would buy your card as opposed to that of a competitor. The other thing is that postcards also represented, of course, the ideology that the British brought with them to India. So you had many postcards recollecting the mutiny. So one of the things that made Tux, I think, very successful is that the back of Tux cards from the Oilettes, from almost just the very first Oilettes on, always had a caption, which was, quote, educational, but also told you something about the picture. And I think this distinguished them from most postcard publishers who did not put the effort into having such a caption. But the caption here is, sacred to the perpetual memory of a great company of Christian people, chiefly women and children, who near this spot were cruelly murdered and cast, the dying with the dead, into the well below on the 15th day of July, 1857. They're talking about the well on the right at Kanpur. So these memories functioned, much like the memories of 9/11 today, as a way of memorializing the event. And remembering it was a way of paying honor to the victims of it. And here you have two stamps put on top, I think, perhaps more for decorative. Although if you want to track what the stamp meaning is supposed to be on this card, on the left, it says, I am not free. On the right, it says, I love you. So maybe this was, I think this was somebody writing. This was, I think, a woman writing to a man, but, who knows exactly what they meant. But typically, probably it was done for beauty or for some kind of message. And this is where the massacre actually took place, the Kanpur massacre. And they're writing on the 27th of June, 1857, the garrison, having capitulated, endeavored to embark here under promise of safe passage to Allahabad. Fire was treacherously opened upon them from the banks by the rebels. A few escaped. 125 women were carried back to Kanpur and slaughtered, their bodies being cast into the well. So, in any case, it's these captions and this sort of, I would say ideological tissue, was also part of what postcards did and what they served as for imperial memory and the way the British saw themselves. These are postcards of Kashmir that were made, and also the other thing that I'm going to talk about this more in a second is that the best postcards were actually made ultimately by painters. You had Gerhardt at the beginning, you had Hoffman. This is F. Parbury, who was a British painter who made these postcards, perhaps inspired by photographs, but, of course, having his own fantasy as well. But the postcard publisher wrote of these, in a special note, we may advantageously take a glance at the latest emanations from Raphael House, especially knowing the 6 pictures in the Wide Wide World series of the lake and mountain scenery of Kashmir after Mr. F.E. Parbury. This was about February 1906. And this is 2 Sikha Kalis at the Golden Temple, another very beautiful card, which was part of the Native Life in India series, I think one of the later series. So you can see postcards playing many roles, often illustrating things that we actually have no other access to. And I've never found the photograph that may have gone behind this postcard, for example. So they're not just imperialistic, educational, they're also beautiful, they're works of art, they have messages on them. There's an incredible richness to postcards and the many angles and perspectives in them. And of this postcard, the Picture Postcard Monthly wrote, the most striking of the remainder of the cards depicting the Golden Temple of Amritsar, the central shrine of the Sikh faith, and a group of those picturesque secretaries on the same day. Messieurs Tuck and Son have kindly given us permission to reproduce the last one. This was 1907, which was, by the way, the last year of the Picture Postcard Monthly. So after that, there are no more issues. And like its Viennese counterpart a few years before that, the fad just started dying off by 1907, 1908, a little bit. At least it wasn't big enough, even though postcards still sold very well until World War One, when trouble started happening and most of the German printing presses were ultimately destroyed, and the British market suffered as well. But I wanted to sort of end by talking about probably the greatest and my favorite postcard artist, Mortimer Mempes, who published both with Tux as well as AC Black and Company, another British publisher. And he and M.V. Durandar, who worked in Bombay, India, is a great Indian painter who was at the J.J. School of Art. He's really one of my favorite postcard artists. And he was actually a Britishman. He was born in Australia, and his family had moved from Britain and then came back, and he went to schools of art and so forth. And he was a friend of the great American painter who was living in Britain, James Whistler. He was an expert at printing. He would source out Japanese style print papers for Whistler and work on them. So like Gerhardt, like Durandar, like Ravi Varma, like a number of these artists, he understood the printing process very well. And that, I think, helps explain why he actually made some of the really most beautiful British-produced postcards of India. So, for example, look at the Rajput on the left, where you just see the colors rising up to the man's face, I think, in a very beautiful way. On the right, you have a belle of Northern India, although the original title of this postcard, which I like a little bit better, was Late Afternoon. So in the postcard, in the earlier version of the earlier story in the Postcard Monthly, Richardson wrote that Mortimer Mempes has told us, and truly told us, that we need more color in our life. That the greatest need of the West, and especially in England, is more color in our costumes, in our homes, and our surroundings. But however true this may be from an aesthetic point of view, in real life it is very difficult, if not impossible, to carry out our ideals. But if we cannot have color in our clothes and our climates, we can then at least have it in our postcards. So the caption, by the way, that he had put to this postcard is, the women of Delhi and its district are, to the Western eye, rather more pleasing than those of many other parts of India. They often affect a swinging, bell-shaped skirt of striking color and are decorated profusely with armlets and anklets that jingle rhythmically with their stride. So these are two more shots. I mean, one of the things I like about Mempes is that he actually was able to be an observer who would show people in a way, from the back doing their crafts. He was kind of invisible, and other times do frontal shots, and in all cases. So he wrote himself, and he wrote a book with his daughter about his trip to India. India surpassed my wildest expectations. The scenes I saw fired my brain, quickened my pulses, and filled my soul with a mad and eager longing to paint, now and at once. But alas, my color box did not hold such pigments. The brightest colors in my tubes appeared but dull and faded, and would not nearly correspond to the glowing tones of earth and sky, houses and shops, and of the ever-changing multitudes that thronged and filled the streets about me. These are two more shots, and he was also an expert on line, by the way, not just in color. These are street scenes in Delhi, and Indian workers, silversmiths, I think, on the left. So his versatility is really, great. The caption for a street scene, by the way, was a street scene Delhi. To pass through the streets of Delhi, threading one's way through its countless denizens, men, women, children, bulls, camels, oxen, etc., is to walk in a dreamland. The kaleidoscope of color, the indescribable color, the dust or mud according to season, all blend to the senses and become a lasting impression upon the mind of the beholder. The tailor on the left, I think, was actually done in Amritsar. A very fine portrait, which also appeared. He did a book with his daughter on the Darbar, and many of these pictures were also used and then printed. And then on the right side is a burlap cart, I think from Jaipur. And on the left, I wanted to say one thing about this painting on the left, which is, watching the page and watching, the Darbar, is that it almost could be a photograph. And he's almost mimicking that instant in a photograph. Because as his daughter Dorothy wrote in the book, that this was the most photographed event of all times at the time. And there were so many photographers around. And it's almost as if, Mempes is sort of mocking look of the photographer and the woman looking back, and it seems like a fragment in a moment in time. And on the right is one of the sort of quotes, which I think sums up what the postcard meant for people. This is from a Tux envelope on one of their India series, where they say, "It has well been said that a Tux postcard is a present to the child, a hand clasp to the man, a kiss to the maiden, and a memory to the old." So that gives you a sense of what postcards meant to people there. And I think it's really, something that I think still today has not been properly sort of understood and researched by scholars and historians as a means of, connecting with both the past at that time, especially, early part of the 20th century, but also the messages and the ways people used postcards as a way of connecting and communicating with each other. And that I think makes them very interesting. So I've summarized some of this in my book, Paper Jewels, Postcards from the Raj. I have a website where I put up images. They're free to use. Even commercially, it's no problem. If you need a high resolution image, let me know. And what I will say too is that if you know anything more about postcards that I've missed, please let me know. It's great to hear from people and learn more about postcards. I think one of the funnest things about collecting postcards is you can never have enough. So even if I have maybe, 15,000 today, I'm always, getting new ones. And even then, when I think of the whole of Tux series, I only have maybe 500-600 Tux. They're probably, well over 1,000. And you're always discovering new postcards out there that you haven't seen before. And they always offer a little bit of a window into history. So with that, let me stop my share. And please, I'm happy to answer any questions or, any reflections or thoughts any of you may have.
I'll jump in with a question that's come up on the Zoom feed,
yes.
which you may or may not be able to answer. So this is from Michelle Domini, who's over in the US. And she says, from the picture postcard publication, is there an identification for the Darjeeling tea estate dated 1901? She's wondering if the publication provides the actual name of the tea garden of the bungalow.
I do not know if there is an identification. And this is something which, a community like, Fibis or Baxa or some other group, somebody may know which tea estate it is, or at some point I may run into the photograph at the British Library, in which case I will know. But at this point, I'm sorry, I don't know exactly which tea estate it was.
Okay, there you go, thank you. Anybody else here that wants to ask any questions? Yes, one at the back here. I'll just give you a microphone.
Two questions, if I may. I'm unclear whether the majority of the cards we've seen were sent from India to Europe, or are they between people in the UK or within Germany? And the second thing, did the price stay at a penny? I had to go out at lunchtime today to buy 2 greetings cards, and one was £2 and one was £3, which is probably at the lower end, but I always feel exploited when I buy a card. I don't know whether the big margin is made by the retailer or the printer, but I say, did it say a penny? They look great value for a penny, certainly those.
Actually, that's a great question. And look how expensive postcards have become. No wonder we use Instagram and all that kind of stuff, which is free. But I think there were 2 pennies. Color cards could be 2 pennies, and this is the old penny, right? Which is, which was I think even less than the more recent penny. So I think it's like prices changed, and really nice lithographic cards could be a little bit more. But so I'm not 100% sure exactly when the big price changes happened and how we got into a world where it's a pounder card, which is something else. But so it was a very fiercely competitive market, and that drove the costs and the types of technologies that were used, and the mass printing, down, and the sort of move to halftone and less ink and all of that. But I think it came down to a penny rather quickly by the early 1900s, thanks to Hartman, and probably stayed that way for quite some time before maybe it started rising again. But I'm not 100% sure about that. Very good question about postcards being sent. Postcards, the postcards that I would get today from dealers or online websites and otherwise from people, many were sent from India, many were sent within Britain, some were sent from within Europe to people in Britain, or people who had been in India coming back to Britain, sending it to friends in Europe. Cards could be sent within India. They're just every possible iteration of cards could be sent. That said, a big chunk of cards that we find today were actually not sent. They were collected. So you had collectors go and buy them from postcard stores. And by the way, cities were full of postcard shops in those days, and London as well, which we don't even barely see today. And people would buy postcards and then collect them and put them in albums or put them in boxes and keep them. And those postcards were often well preserved, and we find with dealers today. And I think 30 to 40%, different estimates are there, of all postcards were made in those days for collecting and purchased by collectors as opposed to being sent in various ways. But you find the most interesting, combinations of postcards sent, Japanese postcards sent to India, whatever. It's like it's really part of a global network. But yeah, I would say every possible way of sending postcards was around then.
Well, thank you very, very much, Omar. Fantastic selection that, entertained us and also informed us. And it's quite comforting to know, really, that there are people like you who are archiving these collections of historical documents, I would say, because so many aspects of social history, political history, are contained in collections such as that. You must be very, very proud of having collected so many, I'm sure. What are you going to do with eventually?
I'm trying to restore them and make them freely available to people to use so that they sort of come back into circulation. And ultimately, my plan is to donate them to some museum or, some collection somewhere, perhaps in India or Pakistan, just somewhere to get them back to, closer to where, most of them are of. But I'm not sure yet. I still hope to be collecting for a while and decide what to do. But I think making them available digitally is one way of bringing them to wider attention, and putting them back in the public domain is something that I sort of like to do. But right now, it's still, the fun is in collecting, and there's still a lot more to collect. So I'm sort of focused on that, and then we'll see how what to do with them at a later time.
So it's a work in progress.
Thank you all very much. Yes, it's a work in progress, certainly.
Yes.
And thank you all. It's been a real pleasure, and I, really admire the work you're all doing, and the way you guys are all bringing history together as well. And it's very inspiring to me as well. So good luck to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night from all in Oxford.
Good night. Bye-bye. Okay. All right. Good night. Bye-bye.